The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Ravencrest Palace as Queen Isabella walked through the ornate corridors with measured steps. Her silk gown rustled softly against the polished stone, but her mind was far from the elegant surroundings that had been her home for nearly 2 decades. Today would change everything. Today, she would finally tell King Alexander the truth that had been eating away at her soul for years. Isabella paused before the massive oak doors of the king's private study, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the golden handle. Through the frosted glass panels, she could see Alexander's familiar silhouette bent over his mahogany desk, probably reviewing the morning reports from his advisors. He looked so peaceful, so trusting. In a few moments, that peace would be shattered forever. The queen took a deep breath and knocked gently on the door. "Alexander, may I come in? We need to talk." The king looked up from his papers, his weathered face breaking into the warm smile that had first captured her heart 25 years ago. "Of course, my dear. You know you never need to knock." He gestured to the leather armchair across from his desk. "What brings you here so early? You look troubled." Isabella entered the room but didn't sit down. Instead, she walked to the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens where their 3 children had played as youngsters. Prince Marcus, now 22, and preparing for his future role as heir to the throne. Princess Elena, 20, studying abroad in Switzerland. And Prince David, just 18, still finding his way in the world. They would all be affected by what she was about to reveal. "Alexander," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something I've been keeping from you, something that happened long before we married, but its consequences have shaped our entire life together." The king set down his fountain pen and gave her his full attention. After 30 years of marriage, he knew when his wife was deeply troubled. "Isabella, you're frightening me. What could be so serious? We've weathered many storms together." She turned away from the window to face him directly. The morning light streaming behind her created an almost ethereal glow around her still beautiful figure, but her expression was grave. "Do you remember when we first met at the ambassador's ball? How I seemed so different from the other young women at court?" Alexander smiled at the memory. "How could I forget? You were the most intelligent, most captivating woman I'd ever met. You spoke 5 languages fluently, knew more about political strategy than most of my advisors, and had this mysterious quality that made everyone wonder about your background. That mystery wasn't accidental. Alexander, I wasn't born Isabella Montclair, daughter of a minor nobleman from the northern provinces." Her voice grew stronger now, as if speaking the truth was giving her courage. "My real name is Isabella Blackwood, and I was born in the slums of Millhaven to a seamstress and a dock worker who died when I was 7. The king's smile faded slowly. "I don't understand. Your father, Lord Montclair, introduced you at court. I met him several times. Lord Montclair was paid to claim me as his daughter. The real Isabella Montclair died of pneumonia when she was 16, while studying in France. I was working as a tutor for wealthy families then, having educated myself through sheer determination and borrowed books. When certain powerful people learned of her death, they saw an opportunity." Alexander stood up from his chair, confusion and concern etched on his face. "Certain powerful people? Isabella, what are you talking about?" The queen walked closer to his desk, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "The Shadow Council, Alexander. The group of nobles and businessmen who believed they could better control the kingdom's future by placing someone of their choosing near the throne. They found me, trained me, gave me Isabella Montclair's identity, and sent me to catch your attention." "That's impossible," Alexander said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're telling me our entire courtship was orchestrated? That you were—" "What? Some kind of spy?" "Not a spy exactly. More like a carefully crafted solution to their problem. They knew you were intelligent, that you wouldn't be easily manipulated by an obvious political marriage. So they created someone who would appeal to your mind as well as your heart, someone who could influence your decisions without you realizing it." The king sank back into his chair as the implications began to hit him. "Our marriage, our children, everything has been a lie?" "No." Isabella stepped forward urgently. "That's just it, Alexander. What they didn't count on was what actually happened. Yes, I was sent to meet you. Yes, I was trained to be appealing to you. But they never planned for me to actually fall in love with you. They never expected that I would come to genuinely care about this kingdom and its people. She moved around the desk and knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. For the first year of our marriage, I dutifully reported back to them. I told them about your plans, your concerns, your decisions. But as time went on, as I truly came to know you and love you, I began feeding them false information. I started protecting you from their manipulations instead of facilitating them. Alexander pulled his hands away and stood up abruptly, walking to the fireplace where portraits of his ancestors looked down at him with stern expressions. How long has it been since you've had contact with them? 15 years, Isabella said quietly. I thought I was free of them. I thought they had given up or found other ways to pursue their goals. But 3 weeks ago, I received a letter. The king turned around slowly. What kind of letter? Isabella reached into the pocket of her gown and withdrew a cream-colored envelope with elegant handwriting. They want to meet with me. They say they have new information about Prince Marcus's future that could benefit the kingdom. They're threatening to expose my true identity if I don't cooperate. And that's when you decided to tell me the truth. Yes, because I realized that no matter what happens next, I couldn't continue living this lie. You deserve to know who you really married. Our children deserve to know the truth about their mother. And if this secret comes out anyway, it should come from me. Alexander walked back to his desk and picked up the letter, scanning its contents. His face grew pale as he read. They want you to influence Marcus to support the new trade agreements with the eastern provinces, the ones that would primarily benefit the textile and shipping industries controlled by the same families who originally recruited me, Isabella confirmed. They haven't given up, Alexander. They've just been playing a longer game than I realized. The king set the letter down carefully, as if it might explode. If this becomes public knowledge, it won't just destroy our reputation. It could destabilize the entire kingdom. Our enemies would claim that our marriage was illegitimate, that our children have no right to the throne. I know, Isabella whispered. That's why I've been so terrified to tell you. But living with this secret was destroying me from the inside. And if they're going to use it against us anyway, at least now we can face it together. Alexander looked at his wife for a long moment, studying her face as if seeing her for the first time. The woman I fell in love with, the mother of my children, the queen who has stood beside me through every crisis for 30 years. Who is she really? She's both people, Alexander. I was born Isabella Blackwood in poverty, but I became Isabella Montclair through determination and circumstances I couldn't control. And when I married you, I became Queen Isabella not just in name, but in my heart and soul. Every decision I've made for the past 15 years has been guided by my love for you and my commitment to our people. The king walked to the window and stared out at the kingdom he had ruled since his father's death. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did at this moment. What do they want you to do now? Meet with them tomorrow night at midnight in the old chapel outside the city. They want an answer about whether I'll help them influence Marcus, and they want to discuss other ways I can be useful to their cause. And if you refuse, they'll make sure every newspaper in the kingdom and beyond knows that the royal family is built on a foundation of lies and deception. Alexander turned back to face her, and Isabella was shocked to see tears in his eyes. Do you have any idea how this makes me feel? To know that the most important relationship of my life began as someone else's political strategy? Alexander, please understand, but that's not even the worst part. He continued, his voice breaking slightly. The worst part is that despite everything you've just told me, despite the betrayal and the lies and the manipulation, I still love you. I love the woman who chose to protect me instead of serving her handlers. I love the mother who has raised our children with such devotion. I love the queen who has worked tirelessly for our people's welfare. Isabella felt tears streaming down her face as she realized he wasn't rejecting her. So what do we do now? Now we figure out how to outsmart the people who think they can still control us, Alexander said, his voice growing stronger with resolve. They may have created you, Isabella, but they didn't create us. They didn't create our family or our love, or our commitment to this kingdom. He walked over to her and took her hands again. We're going to that meeting tomorrow night, but not as their pawns. We're going as partners who refuse to be manipulated any longer. Isabella looked up at him in surprise. You want to confront them directly? I want to end this once and for all. One way or another, by tomorrow night, we'll be free of their shadow, or we'll face the consequences together. As they stood there in the morning light, holding hands and preparing for the battle ahead. Neither of them could have predicted just how far their enemies were willing to go to maintain their control. The truth that Isabella had finally shared was only the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous game than either of them had imagined. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 9 times, marking the beginning of what would be the most challenging day of their reign. In 24 hours, everything would change forever. The rest of that day passed like a strange dream for King Alexander. He found himself studying his wife's face during their lunch with the palace staff, searching for signs of the deception she had just revealed. But all he saw was the same intelligent, caring woman he had loved for 3 decades, the woman who remembered every servant's name, who insisted on personally reviewing letters from common citizens, who stayed up all night when any of their children were sick. Isabella, meanwhile, moved through her royal duties with a mixture of relief and terror. The secret that had poisoned her thoughts for so long was finally shared, but now they faced an even greater challenge. As she met with the head gardener about the spring flower arrangements, she found herself wondering if this might be one of the last normal conversations she would ever have as queen. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Alexander made a decision that surprised them both. "I want to know everything," he said quietly, sitting on the edge of their 4-poster bed. "Before we face them tomorrow night, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." Isabella sat beside him, still wearing the emerald necklace he had given her for their 10th anniversary. "It's a long story, and not all of it reflects well on me. We have all night." So Isabella began at the beginning. She told him about her childhood in the cramped apartment above her mother's sewing shop, where she had learned to read by candlelight using discarded newspapers. She described how her mother's death when she was 15 had left her completely alone, working as a cleaning girl in wealthy households during the day, and teaching herself mathematics, languages, and history at night. "I was 19 when Lord Pemberton first noticed me," she said, referring to one of the kingdom's wealthiest industrialists. "I was tutoring his youngest daughter in French, and he overheard me correcting some errors in a political document his secretary had prepared. He was amazed that a servant could understand complex international trade policies." Alexander listened intently as she described how Pemberton had introduced her to other members of what they called the Shadow Council. These were men who owned the kingdom's largest businesses, controlled its banks, and had grown frustrated with what they saw as King Alexander's independence from their influence. "They spent 2 years training me," Isabella continued, "not just in etiquette and royal protocol, but in psychology, negotiation, and subtle manipulation. They taught me how to ask the right questions to get information, how to plant ideas so naturally that you would think they were your own thoughts." And the real Isabella Montclair? She had been studying in France since she was 14. Few people in our kingdom had seen her since she was a child. When she died of pneumonia, the school sent word to her father. But the letter was intercepted by someone working for the Shadow Council. They forged documents showing that she had died in a carriage accident on her way home, and they buried an empty coffin with great ceremony. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. They murdered her? No. Her death was genuinely from illness. But they saw an opportunity and took it. Lord Montclair was drowning in gambling debts. They paid off everything he owed in exchange for his cooperation. He truly believed he was helping his daughter by giving her a new identity and a chance at a better life. So when you appeared at court as Isabella Montclair, everyone assumed I was the same girl who had left for France years earlier, just more mature and sophisticated from her education abroad. The few people who might have questioned the deception were either in debt to Shadow Council members or had been convinced that keeping quiet was in their best interests. Alexander stood and walked to their private balcony, looking out over the sleeping city. "How did they know I would be attracted to you specifically?" Isabella joined him at the railing. "They had been watching you for months, studying your preferences, your interests, your weaknesses. They knew you were intellectual, that you valued intelligence over pure beauty. They knew you felt isolated by your royal position and would be drawn to someone who seemed to understand that burden. Everything about our first meeting was calculated, down to the book I was reading when you approached me. They made sure it was a rare edition of political philosophy that would spark your interest. They even had someone mention to you earlier that evening that the mysterious young woman in the blue gown was reportedly fluent in 5 languages." The king gripped the stone railing so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What about our wedding night? Our first kiss? Was any of it real?" Isabella turned to face him, tears glistening in the moonlight. "That's what they never understood, Alexander. They thought they could control human emotions the same way they controlled business deals and political appointments, but they couldn't program me to fall in love with you. And they certainly couldn't program you to love me back. When did you realize you actually cared about me? It was about 6 months after our wedding. You had been working late trying to resolve a dispute between the farmers and the merchants over grain prices. I found you asleep at your desk at 3 in the morning. And there were pages and pages of notes where you had been trying to find a solution that would be fair to everyone. That's when I realized you weren't just a figurehead they wanted to manipulate. You were a man who genuinely cared about our people's welfare. Alexander remembered that night. He had woken up to find a blanket draped over his shoulders and a cup of warm tea waiting on his desk, along with a note from Isabella suggesting a compromise solution that had actually worked. What information did you give them during that first year? Nothing too damaging, I thought at the time. Your schedule, your meetings, your concerns about various policies. But they used even the smallest details to their advantage. When you mentioned being worried about unemployment in the mining regions, suddenly Lord Pemberton's company submitted a proposal for a new mining operation that would create jobs. When you expressed interest in improving trade relationships with neighboring kingdoms, they made sure their shipping companies were perfectly positioned to benefit from any new agreements. They were always one step ahead because of the information you provided. Yes. And it made you trust them more because their proposals always seemed so perfectly timed to address your concerns. You thought they were just astute businessmen who understood the kingdom's needs. Alexander sat down heavily in one of the wrought iron chairs on the balcony. When did you stop reporting to them? Gradually. First, I started editing the information, leaving out details that might be too useful to them. Then I began reporting things that were slightly inaccurate. By the time Marcus was born, I had stopped meeting with their contact entirely. They just accepted that? Not exactly. They sent warnings at first, reminders of what they had done for me and what they expected in return. But then something unexpected happened that gave me leverage against them. Alexander looked up sharply. What kind of leverage? Isabella hesitated, then sat down across from him. I discovered that Lord Pemberton's son, Richard, was embezzling money from the royal treasury. He had been skimming small amounts from various accounts for years, thinking no one would notice. But I had learned their methods of detecting patterns, and I spotted what he was doing. You could have exposed him. Instead, I confronted Pemberton directly. I told him that his son's criminal activities would be overlooked as long as the Shadow Council left me alone. It was a standoff that worked for 15 years. Until 3 weeks ago. Until 3 weeks ago, Isabella confirmed. Pemberton died last winter, and apparently, his son Richard has taken over his father's role in the Shadow Council. The balance of power has shifted, and they feel confident enough to make demands again. Alexander stood up and began pacing the small balcony. What do they really want, Isabella? It can't just be about trade agreements. I think they want to position themselves to influence Marcus when he becomes king. They're looking ahead to the next generation, and they want to make sure they have the same access to power they've always enjoyed. Over my dead body. That might be what they're counting on, Alexander. You're 57 years old. They might be betting that they only need to wait a decade or two before Marcus takes the throne, and they want to make sure I'm still useful to them when that time comes. Alexander stopped pacing and stared at his wife. Is there anything else? Any other secrets that could come out tomorrow night? Isabella was quiet for a long moment. There is one more thing. Something I discovered just recently that made me realize how dangerous they still are. What is it? Richard Pemberton isn't just his father's son taking over the family business. He's Prince David's biological father. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He grabbed the back of his chair to steady himself, his face draining of all color. What did you just say? During the early months of our marriage, when I was still reporting to them regularly, Lord Pemberton insisted that I prove my loyalty in a more personal way. He said it was necessary to guarantee my commitment to their cause. I refused at first, but he threatened to expose me immediately if I didn't comply. Alexander sank into the chair, his breathing becoming shallow. David isn't my son. I only discovered the truth recently when Richard sent me a letter along with the demands. He included a photograph of himself at David's age, and the resemblance was unmistakable. Then he mentioned that his father had always felt a special connection to our youngest prince. Does David know? No one knows except Richard and me. But now he's using it as additional leverage. He says that if I don't cooperate, he'll not only expose my false identity but also reveal that the royal bloodline has been contaminated by commoner blood. Alexander buried his face in his hands. Our son, David, is still your son in every way that matters, Isabella said firmly. You raised him. You love him. He loves you. Biology doesn't change that. But Alexander was struggling to process this new revelation on top of everything else. The foundation of his life seemed to be crumbling beneath him. How could you keep this from me for 18 years? Because I convinced myself it wasn't true. Lord Pemberton died before David was born, and I never saw any resemblance. It was easier to believe that you were David's father, and nothing Richard could say would change that belief. Until I saw that photograph. Alexander stood up abruptly and walked back inside their bedroom. Isabella followed, watching as he poured himself a glass of brandy with shaking hands. Tomorrow night, he said finally, when we meet with them, they're going to demand more than just influence over trade agreements, aren't they? I think they're going to demand that I convince David to abdicate his position in the line of succession, claiming that his illegitimate birth disqualifies him. That would make Marcus more dependent on their support and give them more influence over the future of the kingdom. Alexander drained his glass and set it down with more force than necessary. We can't let that happen. I know. But I don't see how we can stop them without destroying everything we've built together. There has to be a way, Alexander said, but his voice lacked conviction. There has to be something we can do. As they finally went to bed that night, both of them lying awake staring at the ceiling, neither could shake the feeling that their meeting tomorrow night would change not just their lives, but the future of the entire kingdom. The truth that Isabella had carried for so long was now a weapon in someone else's hands, and they were running out of time to figure out how to defend themselves against it. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, marking the beginning of what would be their last day of relative peace before everything they had built together would be put to the ultimate test. The old chapel stood silhouetted against the stormy night sky like a Gothic monument to forgotten prayers. King Alexander and Queen Isabella arrived separately, as instructed, each taking different routes through the winding country roads outside the capital city. The rain that had been threatening all day finally began to fall in heavy drops against the ancient stone walls. Isabella reached the chapel first, her dark cloak soaked through by the time she pushed open the heavy wooden door. Inside, 3 figures waited in the shadows between the broken pews, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of oil lanterns. Richard Pemberton stood in the center, flanked by 2 men she didn't recognize but whose expensive clothes and confident bearing marked them as members of the Shadow Council. Your Majesty, Richard said with a mocking bow. How gracious of you to accept our invitation. Let's dispense with the formalities, Richard. What exactly do you want? Straight to business. I admire that. He gestured to the man on his right, a thin fellow with silver hair and calculating eyes. This is Lord Blackthorne, our new financial coordinator, and this, he indicated the younger man to his left, is Master Chen, who handles our more delicate international arrangements. Isabella studied the 2 strangers, noting the subtle way they positioned themselves to block the exits. I thought this was supposed to be a private conversation. Oh, it is private, Richard assured her. These gentlemen are here because what we're about to discuss affects interests far beyond our little kingdom. Before Isabella could respond, the chapel door opened again, and Alexander entered, water dripping from his traveling coat. He took in the scene quickly, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the tactical disadvantage of their position. Your Majesty, Richard said, not bothering with the mock bow this time. We weren't expecting you. My wife and I have no secrets from each other, Alexander replied, moving to stand beside Isabella. Anything you have to say to her, you can say to both of us. Lord Blackthorne stepped forward slightly. Perhaps that's for the best. It will save us from having to repeat ourselves. Richard smiled coldly. Very well. Let me be completely direct. The Shadow Council has decided that the current royal family has outlived its usefulness. Your independence, Your Majesty, has become problematic for our business interests. Our independence is what makes us effective rulers, Alexander shot back. Effective rulers serve the interests of those who truly control a nation's wealth and power, Master Chen said, in lightly accented English. You have been too unpredictable, too focused on the welfare of common people at the expense of economic growth. Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. What are you proposing? A transition, Richard said simply. King Alexander will announce his abdication due to health concerns. Prince Marcus will take the throne, with Queen Isabella serving as regent until he reaches the age of 25. During that regency, all major policy decisions will be reviewed by a council of advisors chosen by us. That's treason, Alexander said flatly. That's reality, Blackthorn corrected. We have documented evidence of the Queen's deception, proof of Prince David's illegitimate parentage, and financial records that will show the royal family has been profiting from insider information about government contracts. What financial records? Isabella demanded. Master Chen produced a leather portfolio from his coat. Transactions showing that money from shell companies owned by Shadow Council members was deposited into accounts bearing the Queen's signature. Payments that can be traced back to specific policy decisions that benefited our interests. Isabella stared at the documents in horror. Those signatures are forged. I never opened any accounts. Of course they're forged, Richard said pleasantly. But they're very good forgeries, and they'll be supported by testimony from bank employees who have been well compensated for their cooperation. Alexander stepped forward aggressively. You're threatening to frame us. We're offering you a choice, Blackthorn corrected. Cooperate with the transition, and these documents never see the light of day. Your family maintains its dignity. Prince Marcus keeps his eventual crown, and everyone benefits from a more cooperative relationship. And if we refuse? Isabella asked, though she already knew the answer. Then tomorrow morning, every newspaper in the kingdom publishes the complete story. Master Chen said, the Queen's false identity, Prince David's true parentage, and evidence of royal corruption. The monarchy will be so thoroughly discredited that Parliament will have no choice but to dissolve it entirely. Alexander and Isabella exchanged glances. This was far worse than they had anticipated. Not only were they facing blackmail, but a complete coup orchestrated by people with resources they had underestimated. There's something else, Richard added with obvious pleasure. Something that will ensure the Queen's complete cooperation going forward. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small photograph, which he handed to Isabella. In the lamplight, she could see it clearly, and her face went white. What is it? Alexander asked. Isabella's hands were shaking as she stared at the photograph. It's Princess Elena. Your daughter has been enjoying her studies in Switzerland, Richard said conversationally. Lovely girl. Very trusting. She had no idea that her new friend Marcus Pemberton was my nephew when she began confiding in him about her family's private conversations. You've been spying on our daughter? Alexander's voice was dangerous. We've been gathering insurance, Blackthorn corrected. Elena has unknowingly provided us with detailed information about the royal family's private discussions, including conversations about potential marriage alliances, succession plans, and various state secrets. Master Chen spoke up. She's also been photographed in compromising situations with young Marcus. Nothing illegal, but certainly enough to cause a scandal if published widely. Isabella felt the world tilting around her. You're threatening our children. We're protecting our interests, Richard said. Elena will continue her relationship with my nephew, and she'll continue sharing family information with him. Any attempt to warn her or interfere with that relationship will result in very embarrassing photographs being released to the press. Alexander staggered slightly, gripping the back of a broken pew for support. You're monsters. We're businessmen, Blackthorn replied matter-of-factly. This kingdom's resources are too valuable to be left to the whims of sentimental idealists. Isabella looked at her husband and saw the defeat in his eyes. They had walked into a trap that had been years in the making, and there was no way out that didn't destroy their children's lives along with their own. How long do we have to decide? She asked quietly. The abdication announcement should be ready by tomorrow afternoon, Master Chen said. We've already prepared the documents. They just need the king's signature. Richard stepped closer to Isabella, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. There is one more thing, Your Majesty. Something I haven't shared with my colleagues here because it's more of a personal matter. He glanced at Alexander, then back to Isabella. Prince David isn't just my half-brother because of our father. He's also your son with someone other than the king. Isabella's blood turned to ice. What are you talking about? Come now, Isabella. Did you really think I wouldn't investigate thoroughly? David wasn't conceived during your arranged liaison with my father. The timing doesn't match. David was conceived during your affair with Captain James Morrison of the Royal Guard. Alexander made a choking sound. Captain Morrison had been his most trusted advisor, his closest friend. He had died 3 years ago in a riding accident. That's impossible, Isabella whispered. James Morrison kept a detailed diary of his relationship with you, Richard continued relentlessly. Every meeting, every conversation, every intimate moment. He was planning to ask you to leave the king for him when he died. He produced another document from his coat. This is a letter he wrote to you just days before his accident, confessing his love and begging you to tell the king the truth about David's parentage so you could be together. Isabella stared at the letter, recognizing James's handwriting. The affair had been brief, a moment of weakness during a particularly difficult time in her marriage, but she had convinced herself that David was still Alexander's child because the timing had been so close. James never sent this letter because he died before he could deliver it, Richard explained. But I found it among his possessions when I was investigating your background. Alexander was staring at his wife with an expression of complete devastation. Is it true? Isabella's lips moved silently for a moment before she found her voice. Alexander, is it true? He repeated, his voice breaking. Isabella looked at her husband, the man who had loved her despite learning about her deception, who had been willing to fight the Shadow Council to protect their family, who had forgiven her for living a lie for 30 years. And she realized that this final truth would destroy him completely. It's already over, she murmured, her voice barely audible in the storm-lashed chapel. Alexander heard those 4 words and understood their full meaning. Not just that their marriage was over, not just that the monarchy was finished, but that everything he had believed about his life, his children, his closest relationships had been an elaborate fiction. The woman he loved was someone else entirely. His most trusted friend had betrayed him, and the son he had raised with such pride wasn't his child. The king's face went completely white. He swayed on his feet, his eyes rolling back, and collapsed to the stone floor with a sickening thud. Isabella dropped to her knees beside her husband's unconscious form, cradling his head while rain pounded against the chapel windows like the hammering of an angry god. Around them, the 3 men from the Shadow Council watched impassively, already making plans for a kingdom that would wake tomorrow to find its world forever changed. The coronation documents will be ready for Prince Marcus to sign by evening, Lord Blackthorne said to Richard as they prepared to leave. Make sure the transition appears voluntary. Richard nodded, then looked down at the broken royal couple on the chapel floor. What about them? Master Chen adjusted his coat collar against the rain. They'll do exactly what we tell them to do. They don't have any choice left. As the 3 men disappeared into the storm, Isabella held her unconscious husband in the ruins of the old chapel, knowing that when he woke up, nothing would ever be the same again. The truth that she had carried for so many years had finally destroyed everything she had tried to protect. In the distance, thunder rolled across the kingdom like the sound of a world ending, and the rain continued to fall on the ancient stones of a place where prayers had once been answered, but where tonight only silence remained.